right, let's give it a quick minute to let everyone trickle into the room, and make sure you top up your cup of coffee, tea, or anything else that you see fit before we kick things off. It's pretty exciting, Lars. We got about 200 people registered for today's event, so we'll let individuals trickle in.
Yeah, sounds great. Should be fun.
How are we looking in Virginia today?
Rainy day in Virginia. So yeah.
It's wet out here as well. But let's kick things off. So good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. My name is Mike Sheckman. I'm the Regional Vice President with Robert Half, overseeing our operations in British Columbia and Manitoba in Western Canada. Thank you all for joining today's session. I'm thrilled to be hosting today's event, which will see us take a closer look into the role of innovation in HR and really examine the future work through the rest of 2021 and beyond. Now, before we begin today, I'd like to address a couple of housekeeping items. We will be recording today's webinar, and it will be available for on-demand viewing for everyone to follow up with. We'll also send a link to the recording, and we'll share this event via social sites as well. Also, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the discussion with Lars. So please enter any questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible and follow up accordingly as well. Now, participation is also important. We really want to hear from you. We're going to be putting up 4 different poll questions throughout the chat. So really encourage your engagement throughout. So without further ado, really a great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Lara Schmidt. Lars, I know you're humble, so I'm gonna say a couple of things about you. And I know that obviously being out of Virginia, you've been an expert in modern HR practices over the last 20 years in the HR space. You worked out and worked along some major leading global organizations. I know that you've been a major contributor to for Fast Company, and recently your new book that came out late January, Redefining HR, has been a bestseller. So congratulations on that as well. And for any of the guests that hasn't tuned in to Lars' podcast, Redefining HR, you got to check that out. Make sure you plug that in as well. I know that, and we'll be chatting a little bit later on about you co-founding the HR open source. I know that it's much more common in the technology space, but we're going to go through a little bit of how this has accelerated innovation and education and within the HR community. So I'm really excited to hear about that as well. So welcome.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for having me, and thanks for the detailed introduction and background. It's always a little awkward when somebody's reading your bio, so I appreciate the intro.
No, I know you've always been humble with it, and you don't tout too much about your accomplishments. So we gotta do our part to obviously amplify your accomplishments to date. But now, before we dive into this discussion, we've got a lot to unpack today. We want to go into a little bit of the first poll question, which will lead us to a bit of the robust discussion. So if we can pull that up for us. So the first poll question, and it should populate on your screen. Stephanie, let me know there. There we go. So the first poll question for you is, if the choice was entirely yours to make, which work model would best represent your future work post-pandemic? So we'll give it a couple of seconds. First option is working from home for many of us to continue. The second one is back in the office, and the third was the hybrid. So a resounding majority of the folks voted 91%. So Lars, what do you think? Any surprises from this blend or ratio?
Yeah, no. Actually, I think for those of us that have had employees who had the ability to work from home during the pandemic, we're pretty much all going to be hybrid by default. That's going to be the model that most companies are going to be operating under who have employees that have the ability to do work from home. And, that's our reality now and into the future. I think that there are very few companies, again, those that had the ability to have employees work from home that will go back to 100% co-located. Despite pressures that some of you are probably getting from your CEOs to do so, you have some employees who, as you can see from the poll here, are desperate to get back in your office. You have some employees who will never go back in your office, but the vast majority want to be able to spend some time there, but have the flexibility to spend some time at home. I think that the key word in this poll is choice. It's choice. Employees want choice by the overwhelming majority. They want optionality. They want flexibility. And, that's not something that we've always done in HR. So that's going to be a big, challenge and opportunity for us as we continue kind of moving through the pandemic is how do we design kind of work programs and constructs that are centered around employee choice and flexibility. And I think the companies that are able to do that effectively will be the ones that will be coming out of this with a real kind of talent advantage in terms of their ability to draw in talent from around the world.
Yeah, no, we've seen that acceleration, and I think that the future of work has been discussed for many years, and it's almost coined now. The future is now, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's how do people transition to, and what does that look like? Because it's going to be a tremendous challenge. I think we look back and we were thrust into not having the choice. We were all forced to work from home a year ago. And I think the bigger challenge will be the reentry, which we'll get into a little bit later through the discussion. When you're looking at maybe some of the leadership traits, I think this is an interesting point because many leaders didn't have the experience to manage remote teams or lead teams that were in hybrid models. So maybe talk a little bit or share some insight in terms of what's going to be important in terms of leadership and that evolution as we re-enter and have these hybrid work models.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to kind of own what we've experienced. Like many, as much as many employees were, because of the pandemic, working remotely for the first time. Many managers were also working remotely for the first time, and they were certainly managing remotely for the first time. And that's a different skill set. Managing remote employees is just different than managing co-located employees. And because of the velocity through which we shifted to remote, we didn't really have time to equip our managers on how to do that effectively. And so, now you're doing that in the backdrop of a global pandemic when all of your employees are kind of experiencing this in different ways. And so some of us have our kids at home. Some of us have, elder care, challenges that we're dealing with. Many of us are struggling to different degrees with mental health and stress and anxiety and kind of all the things that come with, living through the uncertainty of a global pandemic. So I think as we move through this, managers will have to be, really prioritizing, communication clearly. That's one of the biggest things that is a success enabler for distributed remote work. But also, and I this term is almost becoming a buzzword these days, and so I try to use it cautiously, but empathy and compassion. I think we have to understand that our employees are experiencing this in different ways. And so, you may be a manager and you've got 5 people on your team, and one of them is a single, early career person living in a studio in the city, climbing up the walls, right, feeling lonely and isolated. Another is a parent with 3 kids that can't go to school, and they're homeschooling them while they're trying to work. You can't apply the way that you support and lead and enable them the same way, because their needs are different, their circumstances are different. And so I think that's becoming, we really have to make sure that we're supporting our managers to be able to deal with some of these new situations that they haven't faced before, so that they can be more effective as a leader and as a manager, and really help support all of your employees, regardless of kind of what their own individual circumstances are.
Yeah, no, it's I think our journeys have been quite similar, just in terms of having dependents and kids, and I think isolation is real. I think that
Yeah.
it's been tough, and I think just balancing it. I think you talked about that. I think you do need to tailor every situation differently, and every person needs to be led differently, because everybody's journey has been different over the last year. So we need to continue on that. Great segue as well. Let's move into our next poll question that ties into the hybrid work model post pandemic. So let's bring that up. And the question is, if your organization plans to offer a hybrid work model post pandemic, which of the following do you expect to be the biggest challenge? So fostering collaboration between remote and hybrid teams, maintaining company culture, internal communication between cross-functional departments, maybe the compensation and benefits. I think that's been a hot discussion between people relocating. And then the employee recognition piece, is that going to look a little bit different? Give it a few seconds for everybody to share their thoughts. All right. So 44% of the respondents shared that maintaining company culture was going to be a big challenge, and a close second and third was the fostering collaboration, and that really works between both your immediate team, but also the other departments, because again, what we found from our experience is that the immediate teams that you're on, because you have to be much more intentional in terms of the communication, I think that connection actually increased and collaboration increased. It's where maybe the individuals that you didn't get a chance to see on a daily basis in the kitchen or some of the breakout rooms or throughout the hallways, those are the people that you have to be much more intentional in communicating with. What are your thoughts on this, Lars?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised to see 0 on comp and bens. I was very surprised at that, because I think in particular, as it relates to hybrid work, and or companies. I mean, maybe this because this applies a bit less in hybrid, a bit more for companies that have instituted work from anywhere or entirely distributed programs. But not so much benefits, but compensation is a real point of tension in a lot of organizations, because you have to, and it was interesting. I think when companies first started talking about fully distributed work from anywhere, initially I was in the camp of saying, well, it shouldn't matter where you live. This is the work that you're doing, and if I'm doing that in a very low cost of living versus a very high cost of living, that shouldn't, that doesn't impact the actual work product that I'm creating. But I've listened to a lot of people who do believe in kind of having a bit of localization to the salary. And I'm not saying that I agree with them now. I'm kind of split. Like, I think they both make compelling cases, and I understand the arguments both for and against localization of compensation. I think maintaining culture, the interesting thing when you look at, so the 3 models, right? You have co-located, everybody's in an office. You have fully distributed, nobody is in an office, and you have hybrid, somewhere in between. The vast majority of us are going to be hybrid. Hybrid is by far the most difficult construct of those 3 scenarios. Mm-hmm. So it's not easy to do hybrid well. It's not easy to do hybrid, and again, from a cultural perspective or an employee experience standpoint, making sure that you are not kind of bifurcating your population between people who come into an office and those who don't, and given inherent advantages to those who do versus those who don't. And so I think that from an HR kind of people operations standpoint, what we need to be thinking about right now is, I think for many of us who were co-located and then shifted to remote, we basically just ported everything that we did in an office, and now we're doing it digitally. But the orientation of the things that we did was still based on a co-located culture and an environment. As we start returning to offices at some point this year, if we're not thinking about how we might re-engineer those processes, they will by default give an inherent advantage to those people who come into an office. And that's going to make your employees that are, either fully remote or mostly remote, at a disadvantage. And there is a real risk of that creating kind of fissures in the culture of an organization, if people feel that that they're being disadvantaged by a work construct that you are allowing them to have. So I think that's the big, I wasn't surprised to see that being number one. I think that's the big kind of risk for us and for businesses as more of us kind of move into this new hybrid model. We've got to be really deliberate and mindful about not, kind of fostering programs that create classes of employees.
Yeah. And I think that's the biggest challenge. I think that if anything is keeping me up at night as we get back into a potential reentry down the line is how do we ensure that we're inclusive in that approach and in the communication. And you have to be so deliberate as a leader in the business to make sure we're not excluding somebody from a conversation. And I think just naturally people are because they're in front of each other for 8-9 hours a day, they're going to build a little bit stronger relationship than somebody that maybe just touches base with somebody virtually once every couple of days. So I think there's going to be some challenges that we're going to have to potentially work through. Any ideas or insights around how to optimize that? What have you, through your experiences, I think that especially maybe some of the clients that you've consulted with in the past that already been in a hybrid work model, anything you can share that has worked that really optimizes efficiency and productivity?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing you can do if you're in a hybrid model is orient your policies and programs to fully remote. And what I mean by that is basically all of your kind of internal operating systems around policies, programs, communication, et cetera, are designed as if everybody was default. And everybody was defaulted as if everybody was remote. And so by doing that, even people who come into an office, they're working in ways that are remote. And I'll give you an example of that. The hybrid scenario, and this has happened before the pandemic as well. You have a big meeting. Some people are in the office, some people are out of the office. The people that are in the office, they're looking at a projector. Everybody's sitting next to each other. They're all looking at one big screen. And then you have all these kind of isolated voices chiming in on a Polycom phone from time to time of people who aren't there. They're having a very different experience than all those people who are kind of jointly kind of looking at one screen and interacting with each other. So if you're hybrid, if you're remote by default, in that scenario, everybody's on their laptop. Even the people in an office, they're on their laptop. So maybe you could, if you want to go into a conference room with other people, great. But you're looking at the same screen that the people working, from home or anywhere around the world, are doing. And so I think if you look at companies like, GitLab or InVision or, Elastic or Automatic, there's certainly a lot of companies in technology that have been fully remote from the get-go, and or other hybrid models. The common practice that you hear, two of them. One is engineer your processes and systems as remote by default, and two, be really good about documentation. Documentation, especially for companies that might be more on the remote side of the hybrid spectrum, being able to document your meetings, events, town halls, things like that. It gives a kind of written repository towards all the events, so that if somebody is there and they miss something, or as we've all experienced right now, especially those of us who have kids at home, Wi-Fi acts up and you miss, part of the meeting. You can go back through and there's going to be notes of that meeting. So whatever you missed, you can go back and read. So I think those are two tips to optimize if you're looking at a hybrid structure.
I love that. And there's a lot of negotiation going on Wi-Fi and fighting for bandwidth at home. So I know the battle is real. I'm going to call the play a little bit here. There's a good question in the chat that ties to hybrid work model. Maybe Lars, if you want to share your insight on this, from your perspective, what's going to happen if a company wants individuals to come back to and swing the pendulum all the way back and say, hey, you need to be in the office. Yet an employee says, hey, I'm productive, I'm doing a great job, I want to stay at home, I love the flexibility. How would you deal with that circumstance?
Make sure you've got a great
outside of the
team.
legalities, because I think the
Yeah,
legalities
outside the guy, honestly, and I don't mean to be glib, but like, make sure you've got a good recruiting team, because you're gonna have turnover, especially now. And again, like all jobs are different, so I don't mean that statement is an absolute that applies to every job that exists, but especially for your in-demand talent, your engineering talent, software, sales, those kinds of roles that are massively in demand. You force them back into an office and they don't want to come. Guess what? There's a whole world of companies out there that now will allow you to live anywhere and work for them. So I think that, and I know there's a lot of pressure from CEOs and executives to get people back in office. I know oftentimes, those conversations and that pressure is coming from the top. But you've got to help them understand, hey, look, this is your company. You can make that call. But if you do, kind of legal implications aside, but if you do, we're going to hemorrhage talent. And because now these people who are in demand, they can work for, name any number of blue chip companies without having to relocate. And so if this is the lifestyle or the life circumstances or whatever that is driving them to say, like, I can't come back into an office. If you can't accommodate that, you need to be prepared to be doing a lot of recruiting. Because I think especially as we continue to move through the pandemic, I saw some statistics recently that said it was up in a poll, upwards of 50% of employees have said they're going to be looking for a new job, on the other side of the pandemic. So they call this tsunami of turnover that is on the cusp right now. And if you want to accelerate that, be rigid in how you think about returning to work. I think companies that are offering choice and are able to be more flexible, they're going to have advantage. I think for those companies that are putting a hard line in the sand and saying, when we come back in the office, you have to do it. They're going to have a harder time holding on to that talent.
Yeah, no, it's and it's already, I think the challenge of retention is in the forefront. I think that we're seeing counter offers left, right, and center, and people are scared to lose talent. And I think this will certainly accelerate if flexibility is not shown. And just by the first poll question, it proves that 9 out of 10 people and respondents do want that hybrid, and there's going to be a gap between organizations that are going to be maybe a little bit more forceful in terms of expecting people back in the office at some point. So we let's segue a little bit to talk about work-life balance. I think that it ties to working from home, and it's funny because I think people thought that, hey, when they work from home, it means that they're going to have work-life balance, and flexibility doesn't really equal work-life balance. If anything, and I'll speak to my own experience, I'm probably spending more time in front of the screen between these four walls. What I used to spend in commute time, I'm probably working at some point, and many others. I think people feel like they work more now and over the past year than ever. So how are organizations moving forward in terms of making sure that people are not burning out and fighting the fatigue that's happening, being short-staffed around North America?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing we have to acknowledge about our current circumstances is that this isn't really remote work. What we've been doing the last year is not remote work. This has been like, I'm home, my kids are home, I'm a teacher, I have all these other things that are happening. Like we often talk about this as like, oh, we've all moved to remote work. Like, this isn't really remote work. This is like survival for many of us. And I think we've got to be honest about that. Like, I think that's one of the, and I would probably use some of this data point for those of you that work in companies and you might have leadership that's pushing to get people back in office. It's like, imagine, think about how productive our employees who have been working from home have been during this period of time, with many of the kind of social support networks they need, schools, transportation, et cetera, removed. Now, imagine if they have those again and the ability to actually, for an entire work day, structure intentional work. Like, imagine the productivity that happens then. So I think we can't really use what we've been our employees have been managing as the benchmark of what remote work looks like, for all those reasons. So I think that's an important consideration that we need to be thinking about. As we kind of design what this looks like moving forward. And, Mike, pull me back to you, because I want to make sure that I'm giving you a specific answer on that last question. So run that by me one more time.
Just more in terms of work-life balance, like what can an organization do moving forward to, for us, something that we've done is have some availability or flexibility. What we've seen with some of our clients is windowed work. So this was something that was coined where, maybe I do have to take my child to school between 8 to 9. So my work week my work day is going to look like a little bit different. Not the traditional 9 to 5. It's going to be 9 to 11, and then going to be off from 11 to 1. Then, so my day might be longer, but it's going to give me the flexibility to actually break down the work day to give that balanced approach. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, look, you nailed it. It's flexibility. It's choice. I think as we move into this, the fascinating thing, a lot of the constructs of, quote unquote work are held over from the industrial age, like 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, working in an office, right? Those were long held truths that, really don't necessarily make sense for how we live today and how the tools that we have access to today. Like, there wasn't an internet when that was created. There wasn't a laptop. There wasn't even computers. Like, you had to physically be somewhere. Now you don't in many roles. And so I think companies that are able to be flexible and design work around what's best for their employees, that's where work-life balance comes in. It's not this notion of like, I'm going to give you, rigidly, I'm going to give all of our employees every other Friday off. Like, that's great. It's great that you're doing that. But, if you ask them, some would say that would be great. Some would say I would rather chop, 2 hours off my core hours of the day. Some might say I would rather have, work a half day every Friday, right? I think we're all, this is what makes our job in HR difficult right now, is because we're not accustomed to working in the constructs of personalization and choice. We're used to saying, here's the program, this applies to everybody. And that doesn't really work. That's not really going to work in the future and kind of where we are now. And so I think in terms of like how we shift our habits and what we do and how we do it, that's going to be a big shift. So I think the most important thing is to realize that work-life balance is not uniform. And we have to really kind of, design that around what is best for employees. And I know when you think about, particularly those of you working in larger organizations, when you think about personalization at scale, that's terrifying, right? You just think, my God, like I'm barely keeping it together right now. And now I'm supposed to create bespoke programs for every employee. You don't do that. I had an interesting conversation on my podcast a couple of weeks ago with ServiceNow, their head of scaled learning, Thomas Ageni. And, he talked about, personalization at scale isn't about, one-to-one. It's about creating a couple different options and letting employees opt into which one works best for them, right? So as an HR team, we can manage 4 versions of how we think about something in most cases. We can't manage 400, but we can manage 4. And if we can come back to our employees and instead of saying, here's one size fits all, we say, here are 4 choices. You can pick which one works best for you. That's huge for personalization. That's huge for work-life balance. And it's huge for retention, because now it allows our employees to actually opt into work constructs that best serve their own personal circumstances.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And I think it has to balance as well between what our employees want and what organizations are looking for, but also how does it affect the end consumer as well and the clients, because some of the flexibility can't come at the cost of the service level that's expected from an organization as well, right? So I think that there's an argument to be had there. So let's bounce and shift gears and get into the third poll question. Let's throw that up there. And the question is, and I know vaccine rollouts are all happening all over North America, but and this is going to play a little bit of a factor in terms of the pandemic, but when do you anticipate the majority of your employees will be able to return to work in the office? So are people feeling optimistic that it's going to be the second quarter of this year, summertime, through the spring, or sorry, the fall, going into the winter? Or as an organization, maybe have you made the decision that you're not going to reopen or have a re-entry until next year? Give it a second. All right, so 41% shared that it's going to be winter. I wonder if that is more of kind of the mental North Star that we talked about before we started today, where it's like, that's, I don't think we're going to open until the end of the year. And that's because I don't want to be let down in any ways. But that's interesting, because it does vary from region to region, I assume. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is pretty consistent with what I've been seeing here in the US. I think September is a date that I hear a lot of, primarily also because of school. If you have, if your employees are parents, and many of them are, and, now you're saying, because originally I think people were talking about July, and it's like, cool, it's summer. My kids are home, but they don't have school to occupy their time. And now you want me to come back in an office? Like, that's not happening. And so I think the view is that, hopefully by September, at least for kind of US companies, from the US perspective, schools will be back and opened up. It'll be safe to, safe as we can make it for kids to return to school. And so at that point, now that parents will have that support network of, school for their kids to be going to, that would be a time that I think they're aiming for. So, but I think even the ones that are saying September, as we know, we can't be absolutely locked into that. I think that's still, aspirational and hopeful. Hopefully it's also accurate, but I think there's nobody that's making, I shouldn't say there's nobody, there's very few people who are making like absolute, like, no matter what the circumstances are on the ground, we're opening this office on X date. Because I think it's just it's too volatile. And if there's anything that we've learned over the last, year plus, it's that we're at the mercy of this pandemic, of this disease, and this will determine and our response to it and our ability to get a handle on it will determine that's going to set the schedule for reopening. So I'm optimistic that September is realistic, but I think there's still need to wait and see. I was interested to see how many respondents in the poll. I just flat ruled out 2021 and said, making no plans until 2022. I think that I certainly understand that decision making, but that was a little bit surprising in terms of the poll feedback.
Yeah, that was interesting. So we know time is gonna, as much as it feels like this year feels like it's been 10 years, and it's aged me. Got a lot of gray hair from this past year, but time is gonna start moving quickly. And how are companies needing to prepare for the reentry? Because it's going to happen, and we talked about the fact that it's going to be much more challenging coming back in than actually going home. What insights can you share in terms of giving maybe companies some tips around this reentry plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of companies are having conversations around return to workplace and what that looks like. And to be perfectly honest, none of them have foolproof, lockdown plans. I mean, even ones that have said publicly, like, hey, we plan on being back, having a part of our workforce back by X date. There's still a lot of moving pieces underneath that X date in terms of how you make that happen. How do you create, make sure that it's safe environment? What's your protocol for testing? What's your protocol for social distancing? What's your protocol for masks and common areas and things like that? You need to have all of that buttoned up. Like, I remember earlier in the pandemic last year, probably around June, at that point, at least in the US, we began having conversations, naively, blissfully naive, about returning to a workplace. And I've been, throughout the pandemic, I've been creating some kind of open source, resources and collections of of plans and communications and things like that around how companies are dealing with this. And I got a document. There was a women's general counsel network in Silicon Valley, and it was most of the female GCs from most of the tech companies, big global tech companies. So it's a massive group. They had a virtual, offsite, whereas basically they had a day, and they all got together and they kind of mapped out all the different implications and considerations associated with return to an office, and then they shared that. So I got a copy and I open sourced it. And I had to transcribe the copy because I got a PDF, and so I literally had to kind of transcribe it into a Google Doc so that I could share it. So I got intimately familiar with all of the aspects of it. And it is a lot. I mean, a lot is an understatement. The complexity of all the safeguards, all the protocols, all the if this then that scenarios that you have to be ready for to have humans back in an office is incredibly complicated. And so I think companies are starting to do that now. I actually just launched a new open source project called Return to Workplace. And in it, I'm kind of crowdsourcing company plans and resources from a range of companies that have gone public and kind of shared their kind of step-by-step, here are the considerations, here's how we think about, if there's a positive test, that kind of thing. So, my advice would be to, view that, bookmark that, because that's going to be constantly updated with more resources so that you can see what your peers are doing. You can read research on, you can read recommendations from, CDC and the Canadian equivalent of that. Yeah. But being able to really just consume all of that content so that you're as informed as possible as you're working with your executive team on making those decisions. So I don't have a hard answer of saying oh, definitely do this and that. I think you have to be a sponge and you have to learn as much as you can, and you just have to have a constant finger on the pulse of what's changing because the whole situation continues to be fluid.
Yeah, no, I think it's bang on. I think that the fluid piece is it's just evolving, and every week it changes. And for us, we were able to use the technology for even booking our desks at the office because we are open and people have the choice to work at our offices. But even doing the online health assessments daily, and I think there's so many different checkpoints and process that needs to be put in place just so that the communication is just clear and concise with the team. So I think it is a bit of an evolution as we move forward. But I would certainly not leave it 4 months. I think it's going to be a longer project that you need to almost build out, and it needs to be one of those documents that's going to change and evolve over time. So great points made. I was going to talk about this a little bit later on and talk about open source, but I think it leads to my next question. So maybe for those that are not familiar with open source, and maybe share a little bit more about what you co-founded, how the HR community has been able to take advantage of it, and then it'll lead me to a question for you.
Yeah, I mean, so open source generally is is developed in software engineering as a practice of basically people are saying if you write a line of code that does X, rather than having everybody who ever writes a line of code that does X have to do that manually from scratch, one person can write it, you can upload it to a shared repository that anybody can access, anybody can download, and then basically the idea is kind of creating a shared repository of resources and information that anybody can tap into for free. And so, the value, most of the modern web, most of the tools that we're using, including Zoom, have open source software in them. And so, I had the idea, myself and Ambrosia Bertessi, who at the time was the head of people for Hootsuite, we were friends and we were talking about the evolution of innovation and progressive practices in HR and or lack thereof. And we thought, I wonder if we could kind of take a page out of open source software's playbook and apply that to HR and kind of create a platform for practitioners to upload case studies, resources, templates, etc. The legacy of HR has often been siloed, proprietary, we didn't share, and that was a big reason what has kind of held back innovation in the field, because it was really hard to learn how to do X, or to learn like what's the best way of thinking about Y, or what's the best tool to do Z, or I need to build a dashboard to do whatever, and I have to build that from scratch every time. And so, we launched HR Open Source basically to do that. And then right around that time, Google relaunched their Rework program, which is a very similar program based on kind of Google practices. And then, since we've seen, Disrupt HR, we've seen communities like Hacking HR and others come about. And I think that the embrace of open source, HR Open Source specifically as a platform, now I'm no longer directly involved with that. Ambrosia and I stepped down about 2 years ago and turned it over to a new board. And so now that's a formal nonprofit. It's a community of over 10,000 practitioners in over 100 countries. But I'm still deeply involved in open source projects that I build out of Redefining HR Incubator right now. And so I think that, to me, the growth and scale of open source and the embrace of the idea of kind of working out loud and sharing and collaborating instead of competing in HR is the single biggest driving factor in our evolution. Because now, if I'm an HR department of one and I don't have a big budget and I can't, pay for memberships or subscription platforms and things like that, I still have a wealth of information I can tap into to help me do my work. I still have a wealth of communities of thousands of practitioners all around the world that I can ask questions to, who have solved that thing that I'm struggling with and are happy to tell me how they did it. So to me, it's essential to modern HR, and it's going to be the thing that really kind of propels our field forward.
I love that. I think that don't treat it as almost as a black box, everything you're developing, right? It's massive. And I think you mentioned previously, I think around the employee experience, which is so prevalent right now. And I think that a couple of times it was a core topic in your book, talking about the legacy HR versus the modern. Maybe take us through a little bit of that definition for you. I think that that's a massive shift for a lot of people. Maybe walk the audience through that.
Yeah, I mean, the core kind of foundation of the book, Redefining HR, is really this evolution of the field from from legacy to modern. And what I kind of posit in the book is that the field of HR is a spectrum. And so oftentimes you say HR is this, HR is that. Well, yeah, maybe it is that, maybe it is this, but it is also this, and this. So I think we get, not we in HR, I think particularly people outside of HR who kind of paint all of HR with the same brush, they tend to look at it as a mono function. And the reality is, you have this leading edge of HR, which is incredibly proactive, strategic, essential, to the business, viewed that way from the CEO all the way down. Yes, on the other side of the spectrum, you still have those legacy teams that are still, more personnel in orientation, transactional, reactive, administrative, in some cases, and you have a big chunk of the field in the middle. And so, throughout the book, I kind of map out a range of, categories or fields and kind of lay out the contrast between modern HR and legacy HR, everything from like diversity, equity, and inclusion to recruiting, to employee experience, to people analytics, et cetera. So I think there's a range of areas where that's different. I think some of the biggest differences, just to highlight a few, are the shift and evolution from command and control to decentralize and empower. And what I mean by that is legacy HR, we were always chasing that coveted seat at the table. And in doing so, we felt that engineering processes and systems through which approvals had to flow through HR was the pathway to power. And so, we created all these deeply bureaucratic procedural systems where we had to sign off on everything, we had to approve everything, and it pissed our employees off. It cost us credibility with our leadership. We thought it was getting us clout, but the opposite actually happened. And I think if you look at the other end of that spectrum, those modern leaders who embrace decentralize and empower, there's no insecurity about the value that they bring to the business. They don't have to prove anything, let alone to themselves. So they bring their business acumen coupled with their HR and people acumen, and they design programs that are all about, like, let's assume we're hiring competent leaders and managers and employees. Let's create some frameworks for them, but let's let leaders lead and manage. And, we'll obviously get involved and support that when we need to, but, we're not going to engineer ourselves into things that we don't need to be engineered into. And so it's a very different mindset. And I think even if you look at it from a policy and compliance standpoint, the legacy model is more around what I frame as policy against the few. Meaning, HR was rooted in risk aversion, and that's obviously compliance is an element of what we do still. I don't mean to undervalue that, but in doing so, we kind of create these environments where we would say, what's the worst possible thing an employee could do? Okay, cool. Let's assume every employee is going to do that exact thing. Let's design, very dense policies to safeguard the organization against that behavior. And the other end of that spectrum, it's more about policy for the many, right? Let's assume we're hiring, people with good intent who are going to make good decisions. Let's keep our processes and our systems and policies lightweight so we don't stifle their ability to impact the business. And if somebody, does something against the policy, you deal with that on a one-off basis. But let's not assume that everybody's going to do it and engineer to safeguard the company against that. So those are just two kind of shifts, fundamental shifts from legacy HR, as I kind of use the context of redefining HR, to modern HR.
Yeah, no, I love that. Going back to the open source and a little bit of the learning and development, I think that's been a major shift as well. I think that learning through osmosis and learning in the office from others, we had to be much more intentional over the last year in terms of training. And as we accelerate hiring, what is that going to look like? Any insights that you can share, just of the way we have to learn, because it's going to look a lot different than the future as well.
I mean, really kind of at the core, this comes down to growth mindset versus fixed mindset. I think that we have to create, you hear some companies talk about building a culture of learning. I don't think that should be unique. I think every company out there should want to build a culture of learning. And I think learning agility is probably the most important skill set that any employee has, certainly that HR practitioners have, because the world we're in right now is very complex and it's only getting more complicated. And I think that much of our traditional education and developmental programs, specifically in HR, are insular, meaning like we learn about comp and bends, we learn about recruiting, we learn about performance. We're rarely supported in developing adjacent skills that aren't necessarily considered HR skills, but are actually really important for us in our day-to-day job. Things like, business writing, things like, executive communication and brand building, things like business acumen and kind of understanding organization's strategic roadmap or P&L, right? Those are things that are important enablers to success as modern HR people, but we often aren't given the tools, the training, and the resources to develop those skills. So I think building that culture of learning, having that learning agility, but also really understanding that the way learning happens in the construct of our busy days right now is micro-learning. Most of us don't have the ability to carve out a week and go to a seminar, or go to a training session. That's just not how learning happens. And so my recommendation to everybody, certainly everybody watching this right now, is I know your schedule is brutal. I know you're balancing demands of family, work, personal, mental health, stress, all these things that come with the reality we're in right now. And so it's very easy, given all of that, to not really think about your own learning and just try to get by day to day. And I think that's a trap that's really easy to fall in. I would recommend, at a minimum, blocking your calendar for 30 minutes every week. A recurring time, defend it, do not let people schedule over it. And that is you time. That is your time to read, to learn. Most of us throughout the week, we have friends sending us articles, or our boss sending us Fast Company articles saying, hey, why aren't we like that? Why aren't we like Google? Or one of those kinds of emails that like, yes, you're not going to be like Google, but you're probably, you don't have time to read that in the moment. Create like an Evernote notebook or wherever you do to kind of clip those articles and the URLs, and then have that time every week where you can go back to some of that stuff. And you can read some of that stuff, and you can take notes, and you can digest, and you can figure out how some of that that knowledge may actually help you in your current role. But that doesn't just happen. You have to make that happen. And that's why I think I'm a big believer in blocking time. I do it myself. So that every week I know that I will have at least X amount of dedicated time to just, absorb and read and learn and grow.
That's pretty awesome. Good insight there. Let's hop into the final question. Let's go to the poll question, which is, what is your most critical area of focus over the next 6 months? So we'll give it a second to populate here. So we got 6 different options for you. So what will be your most critical area of focus over the next 6 months? Some tough ones to choose from here. They're all pretty important. Give it a few seconds. All right, so a third shared that the future of work planning, including office reentry, is going to be top of mind here. And then second is the employee engagement. What do you think, Lars? Surprised?
No, actually. I mean, I'd love to be able to say that, oh, we can just pick 2 and be focused on, we need to be prioritizing, we need to work on. I think that is super important. So yeah, that was not surprising.
And I think just finding some sort of balance between all of them, because there's not one on that list that's not going to be important. And I think it's some will be more important for individuals within the teams. And I think having that conversation is going to be critical as well.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at like the future of work planning, 100% of us have to do that, right? All of us. I think if you look at some of the other things that we may work in organizations that do really well already at some of them, and so maybe it's not as much of a priority. Not that it's not important, but we're already kind of, that's in our wheelhouse. So yeah, so I think it is, it's interesting. But again, this is part of what makes our job so hard. Is we have to be thinking about all these things, and I think what's so unique about our moment in time right now is this is, for many of us, it's kind of a once in a generation opportunity to rebuild what we do, how we do. And I don't necessarily mean that from the ground up, but like we have an opportunity to kind of look at our how we work and how we operate and what our programs are and our systems and our technologies and our approaches, and really kind of try to look at them with a critical eye and say, which of these things are we doing because we've always done them? And which of these things, and you may be doing some of those things and they still serve you really well, but you may be doing some of those things purely from a legacy standpoint. And this is the opportunity for you and kind of your call to arms, if you will, to kind of be able to, under the backdrop at performance, or how we look at learning, or how we look at DEI. I think many of us have to do that. So
yeah, don't let a good crisis go to waste, right? So I think that's something that's been commonly said. You mentioned, Lars, as well, and I think on a couple of different platforms, talking about culture fit, and that's being used as a weapon. Can you share a little bit more context on that? And I think this kind of ties to DEI as well.
Yeah, Mike, and I apologize. As we talk about some of the internet aspects of working remote, I just had to glitch myself. Can you run that question by me one more time?
Yeah, no. You mentioned a couple of times, I think, that whether it was a podcast or on your own channel, you talked about culture fit being a bit of a weapon, and I think this ties to a little bit of DEI and some of the challenges that organizations have faced over the last year. Give us some context in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think culture fit, especially in tech, right, is over the last decade has been one of the buzzwords that we've relied upon heavily as we've built organizations. I think the way that many organizations began using that term, and I call it kind of the weaponization of culture fit, it was basically to rule people out that don't look like them, don't think like them, didn't go to the same schools they went to, don't have the same work style that they do, don't have the same life experience that they do. And so, I certainly advise, I think many companies doing this, where they've outlawed the term culture fit, specifically, at least in the context of interviewing. Meaning, if you're interviewing somebody and a manager passes and you ask why, and they say, well, they're not a good culture fit, and there's no context beyond that, like, no, sorry, that's not good enough. What do you mean by that? How do you mean they're not a good culture fit? What specifically do you find misalignment in their background? And if you can't get a real and meaningful answer to that, it's not going to cut it. So I think in particular, it's easy to hire people who look like us. It's easy to hire people who think like us. And it's very easy for organizations, especially I do a lot of work in tech and startups, in the early stages of growth, it's usually through their own networks who tend to look and think like them. And so, culture fit is a tool against inclusion, the way I see it. And so I think that it's a term that we just need to retire and move on. I think culture itself, yes, that is important. And I'm not diminishing culture. It's this notion of culture fit. I think companies have moved more towards, terms like culture add or values fit, which I think is more easily quantifiable than culture, which tends to be more nebulous.
Yeah, I love that values add. That's key. And I think that what drives innovation, I think that diversity, when you hire people that actually don't look like you and think like you, that's where really the magic happens. I think that's where actually you don't see a certain lens of you. That's where you create a culture of learning and openness and ideas flourish. So all good points. All right, so we're gonna open it up. I know that we got just a couple minutes left, and I want to be respectful of your time and also the audience. Maybe a quick question for you here with around recommendation. Anything that you can add, recommendations for HR sourcing, or you talked about open source. Where can people get some of this great ideas so they don't have to reinvent the wheel? Can you share some ideas there?
Yeah, so a couple. So Google Rework is one. HR open source. Their website is hros.co. And their main community hub is on Facebook. That's a group that I mentioned that has over 10,000 members. Hacking HR is another great global community with lots of resources. Actually, if you go to my company website, amplifytalent.com, there's a section there on open source. And in it, I've curated a range of resources and open source projects that I've directly been involved in, but also other open source projects that I've encountered that I think are valuable. So I tend to curate things there. And then also on redefininghr.com, which is kind of the new hub that I'm building exactly that. So I'm going to be building a knowledge and a resource base, a range of tools, courses, and things like that, supporting kind of modern HR practices and practitioners.
I love that. And then a final question, and I think there's a couple different questions that were spun from this, but tying back to the hybrid work model, any tools that you think are going to be implemented in terms of ensuring that there's going to be productivity, because trust is going to be important, of course, right? We know that this last year has been a little bit interesting, and it's going to be different once it does go back to what the new norm would look like, because kids are going to be in school. There's going to be more freedom to actually get the job done.
Yep.
How is productivity going to be measured? How is trust going to be built? Any tools are out there to help with that?
I would add a question to that before responding is, how did you know that people were getting work done when they were in the office? How do they establish trust other than seeing them physically at a desk when they were in the office, right? Like, it's not that different. I think we expected, it's like, hey, I can't see you, so I don't know what you're doing. So that, I think that's just a perception issue that we have to overcome. Whatever you do not buy webcam monitoring software or those tools. That's evil. It's pervasive. Don't do it. But I would say, tools like, so if you have ways of measuring, it's not about the time and the hours and when the day, it's about the output. It's about, deliverables. So I would default to looking at like, how do you set and measure goals and progress, whether it's, tools like OKRs or different performance measures, and there's tools like 15 Geese to support that. But again, I would focus on outcomes and measuring outcomes and kind of work product than worrying about like, I can't see you, I don't know what you're doing. Assume good intent. And again, like have a set rhythm around, okay, this is what, these are deliverables that we need to get done this week, this month, this quarter. And if that's happening, I don't care when you're doing it, but I care about the output of your work. And so I think it's a bit of a mindset shift. But I do, I get that question a lot, and I always say, well, how'd you know it when they're in the office? It's not, you just can't see them. That's the big difference. But even when you saw them, I don't know what you're doing on your computer. I don't, so yeah, I think you have to reframe that a little bit.
Yeah, I love that. It's a great point. Again, Lars, before we sign off, I want to thank you. We're also going to be surprising 3 of the people and guests that attended today's webinar. We're going to send them one of your books. So we're going to do a random draw, which will be great. Really appreciate and congratulations on the book launch. I know it's been a major hit, and for anybody that hasn't picked it up, make sure you do. It's on, I think it's on Amazon and pretty much all other platforms that are available, and make sure you tune into the podcast as well. So again, appreciate you providing your insight, your expertise. Again, the book is Redefining HR, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Lars.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike, and thanks for all of you for tuning in.
Have a great day, guys. Thank you.